Chapter 7. Master Windu, I respect clone troopers as much as any Jedi, and perhaps even more in some cases. But a certain distance is required from our troops, clone or not. General Sakura is becoming a little too close to Commander Bly, and while I applaud her dedication to the men under her command, this can only end in tears. Jedi General Arlagan Zay, Director of Special Forces, stepping outside his area of responsibility in conversation with Master Mace Windu. I, Han, laid up on Bog 5, 476 days after Geonosis Ordo watched a strange tableau unfolding in the crew lounge of I, Han, as he worked on fitting the enhanced weapons in the ship. While he passed hydrospanners and connectors to Muriel in the engineering section, he kept an eye on Skirata and Val through the open hatch. He was ready to step in and break up an argument, because Calbuir's embarrassed and partial thaw toward his old comrade couldn't last. The Nulls had grown up with the Skirata and Val act arguing, bickering, even fighting. The only thing the two had in common most of the time was their armor and their military skill. Skirata thought Val was a sadistic snob, and Val saw Skirata as an over-emotional, uncultured thug. But for now at least, there was a truce. It felt uncomfortable, like borrowing someone else's clothing. Skirata was trying to be polite and grateful, and neither man seemed to know how to handle that. Their stilted conversation had suddenly given way to very focused and intense discussion in voices that Ordo couldn't quite hear. He tapped Muriel on the knee. His brother's legs protruded from the open access duct as he tested power couplings. Han was going to pack a lot more punch when Muriel was finished. "Mind the actuator housing, Vodika." Ordo laid the metal plate on the deck. "I need to check on Calbuir. Something's going on. Call me if you need to break them up." Val and Skirata were sitting facing each other on the square of sofas, and they were both talking on their cornlinks. They also appeared to be listening to each other in a bizarre jigsaw of a four-way conversation. "You're a good lad, Bardika, and I appreciate the risk you're taking." "What do you mean, no med droid? So where are they now?" "Levitt should have cleaned them out by now. They're only farmers." "Shot at? Who knew they were even there?" "Cal's going to have another meltdown." Skirata paused and stared hard at Val. "Bardika, can you hold on for a moment?" Val held out his hand and they swapped comlinks. "So, Jinnart, what exactly am I going to be angry about?" Skirata listened, head down, and then shut his eyes. Ordo glanced at Val, who shook his head. "Delta," he mouthed, and gestured with Skirata's comlink. They followed Kosai as far as Napdu, and then they ran into some competition. No further contact. Napdu was one stage behind them in the hunt. Events were getting out of hand. Ordo stood by Val's seat and tried to follow both conversations, which was suddenly much harder now that he knew some of the facts, and his brain was trying to fill in too many gaps. His mind wasn't on Delta's safety, and he felt guilty about that. Somehow getting hold of Kosai seemed much more important. There were millions of lives hanging on her after all. "We need to get a move on," he said. He glanced at his chrono, TK0. And Gabe had a few more hours to come up with the pilot who transported Kosai to Doroma, but he needed that information now. If Delta were that close, they were physically closer to Doroma than Han was. In fact, then they stood a chance of getting there first, provided they made the connection. I'm not throwing away this lead. The lead would be a pilot. It was hard to move Kaminoans around and find them accommodation without somebody noticing, even if they didn't recognize the species. Skirata seemed to be getting increasingly upset rather than angry. He had one hand shielding his eyes as if to ignore distractions. All that Ordo could hear was occasional grunts and sighs, as if Jinnart was telling him bad news in extreme detail. Eventually he spoke. "Okay, I'm sending Ordo. No, don't let her move a muskie. Levitt's perfectly capable of doing the job without her. He'll probably be happier with her out of the way, in fact. I'll call in later." Skirata handed the comlink back to Val, who resumed his conversation with Jusik. Muriel wandered up and stood beside Ordo. "Where am I going?" Ordo knew perfectly well where he was going, but he didn't want to go, not with Kosai within reach. He wanted to be in at the end of the hunt. "Beer? I heard Janart, so I assume it's Kilura." Skirata stood up and gave both Nulls a playful but half-hearted shove in the chest. "Adike," he said, "I need Etain out of there fast. She's bleeding where she shouldn't be, and the farmers have settled in for a fight. They're having to pick them off one at a time, asking them to surrender very politely each time." "No wonder we're not winning, if that's how Jedi fight wars," Muriel said. "Rules of engagement, son. Last resort." Ordo had never understood it either. He could recite any statute or regulation, including all 150 contingency orders for the Grand Army, which all clone officers had to know by heart, with all the ease granted by his eidetic memory. But making sense of rules was another matter. Why start a killing war if you were going to slam on the brakes and declare one way of killing someone morally preferable to another? "They'll end up killing them all anyway," Ordo said. He would never disobey his father, and he loved him too much to allow him to be even slightly disappointed, but he had to at least ask. "Kalbuir, are you certain you want me in Kilura? I can be more use to you finding Kosai." "Father. Yes, he'd always felt like Skirata's son, but now he actually was." "Etain's used to you, Ordika." Skirata had promised he would never lie to his men, but he'd admitted not telling Ordo everything. Perhaps he wasn't leveling with him now. "She might get Gedenla if Muriel or Val show up. You know how cranky women are when they're pregnant." "No, I don't." "Well, they are. Hormones. And Etain's cranky enough to start with." Val looked up and put his comlink back in his belt pouch. "I got on very well with the young woman when we last worked together, actually." Skirata gave Val the long stare, the one that said he didn't think the comment added anything useful to the sum of the galaxy's knowledge. Val shrugged and got up to wander around calling for Mird, who'd gone exploring, leaving only his pungent aroma to keep the sofa warm. "Come on, Marika," Skirata said. "Let's contact your tinny friend and find that pilot. Time is of the essence." Ordo couldn't disobey. Cal Buir had his plans, and this was where Ordo fitted in. He didn't have to be happy about it, though. He was being handed a soft job, a nursemaid job, the kind he always did when his brothers were racing around the galaxy, carrying out anything from assassinations to elaborate financial frauds. Do they resent me? Maybe they pity me. "Yes, Kalbur," Ordo said. "I'll treat it as a medical emergency." Muriel tossed him an identichip, the kind that opens security locks. "Take the shuttle I used to get here. I left it next to the cantina." They lived that kind of life. Credits, transport, supplies. The cost was no object. If the Republic didn't bankroll it, they stole it, directly or indirectly. Ordo didn't have any more personal desire for wealth than his brothers. He was used to finding all his needs met, but his needs seemed nowhere near as rich and varied as those of the beings around him. All he wanted right then was a piece of the Sheffa cake that Bisini had sent him, so he took half from the galley, slicing it in 2 pieces with his vibroblade, and left the rest for the others. Even Murd, if Strills ate such things. Then he went in search of the shuttle, just another mercenary wandering around on a lawless planet, and sat in the cockpit chewing the cake for a few minutes. It was dry and spicy against his tongue, like licking scented velvet. The comfort effect was immediate, and from another time and place. Sometimes Ordo felt just as he did when he was a small child, and Skirata first towered above him. Part of him was competent far beyond his years, and the rest was hollow terror because the Kaminiais were going to kill him. But Skirata had snatched him and his brothers to safety and fed them all on Ujalai, a sticky sweet Mandalorian cake. It was a powerful act of salvation, one that had defined Ordo. He felt it as freshly now as he had then. It was the cake. That was it. The cake had brought it all back. He felt safe again. And this was from Bessany Wenin. She was saving him too, in her way. Ordo folded the remains of the cake in a piece of cleaning rag, slipped it into the pocket on the thigh of his flight suit, and fired up the shuttle's drives to head for Kilura. He had no idea yet what to do with a pregnant Jedi who was showing signs of miscarriage on a backworld planet a long way from competent gynecological help. But he'd find out. He was Ordo. Nothing was beyond him. Hut space, 476 days after Geonosis. "He can't shoot straight," Boss said, "but he spoiled my paint job." The TIV jinked again to avoid cannon fire from the pursuing ship. Sev checked via the external holocams, and there it was. A Crusher-class fighter. It harried the TIV, closing up and then falling back several times, loosing cannon rounds to one side, then the other. "You could have creamed it by now, boss." Sev wasn't sure what his sergeant was playing at. Or maybe just hyper-jumped out of here. Forgotten what the big red button's for. Curiosity is the sign of intelligence, Sev. Scorch had a tight grip on the restraining belt. "I'm not that curious. Think about it." Boss rolled the TIV as if he was enjoying it. "If this guy hasn't killed us, either he can't, or he wants us in one piece because we've got something he wants. I want to know who he is." "Sometimes it's better to leave a little mystery in a relationship," said Scorch. Sev felt the steady beat of his heart, nothing else. He'd passed the point of fear, and his body was on autopilot. He'd strapped himself in for a rough re-entry somewhere, almost without thinking about it. So land and see if he follows. You get there eventually, don't you? Nar Shaddaa was the next planetfall, unless they landed on Dasucha, and nobody ever landed there, not even the Hutts who named it. That was going to be cozy. The planet was all ocean except for a couple of small islands that broke the surface. But Delta had done their job and transmitted the data already, so if anything went wrong, another squad could pick up where they left off. Did I secure my locker back at the barracks? I've got the code key here. Firfek, they'll have to force the door open if I get killed. Sev had no idea why he was thinking about death or focused on such a trivial worry. Death hadn't crossed his mind that often before, not in a concrete way. Besides, it wasn't as if Boss couldn't handle a skirmish with a tourist, was it? Anyone who wasn't Grand Army was a tourist, by definition an amateur. The Crusher was chancing it, getting too close. If he tried that tailgating maneuver again, one of them would end up with a hull breach. Scorch seemed intrigued by the idea. What if he thinks we really are a courier shuttle and he's planning a robbery? Fixer came to life. In a fighter? He could have stolen the fighter too. Oh yeah, I bet that happens all the time. We do it. We are special forces. Okay, time's up. Boss banked to starboard, and the array of lights on the navigation's display tilted to show a course for the nearest planet, the third moon. Let's find out. Scorch went through the ritual of checking his suit's seal integrity again. You got charts for that place, boss? Nobody has. Let's make some. The third moon of Dasucha had land masses. Sev could see them as the TIV neared the atmosphere. If the pursuing Crusher really thought his quarry was a courier shuttle, heading for this deserted lump of rock would have tipped him off that it wasn't. But he was still on their tail. Sev closed his eyes and clenched his fists on re-entry. It always bothered him to see the hull temperature climbing on the console display, and thought that it was good of Scorch not to rib him about his phobias. He never had. It's going to be fun when we land. Scorch was going through the motions of hitting the release catch on his restraints and swapping firing modes on his Dees, over and over, like it was all an Urifi meditation ritual. He who disembarks first wins. Nah, Fixer said. He was almost chatty today. He who disembarks first is a nice target. Boss brought the TIV down into a bumpy landing on grassland, skidding 50 meters through driving rain and slewing sideways before coming to a halt. Sev, concentrating on the charge level on his Dees, saw the Crusher's jets almost fill the front viewport as it dropped down in front of them and came about to land with its nose facing them. There was an awkward pause. "He's charging cannons." The TIV shook. Boss swore, and for a moment Sev didn't know if the vessel had been hit or if Boss had fired. Either way, the Crusher clearly hadn't been expecting the TIV to be anything other than a lightly armed vessel, because there was suddenly a cloud of steam building beneath it as it powered its drives again. Then its port wing shattered into fragments, sending a ball of fire into the damp air. "Go, go, go!" Sev was first out as the starboard hatch swung open, dropping into grass that came up to his shoulders and smeared his visor plate with water. The ground squelched under his boots. He ran with his head lowered, shielded by the grasses, and Delta went into a sequence they drilled for 100 times, storming an enemy vessel. Once they were close into the fighter, there was little it could do, and with one wing missing, it wasn't going anywhere in a hurry. Scorch fired a rappel line to hook onto the superstructure, then hauled himself up to slap a strip of flexible charge around the hatch. "I'd knock," Scorch said, dropping down again and diving for cover. "But I think they'll be upset about the wing." Bang! The hatch blew out, flinging twisted metal into the air, and Sev dodged a chunk that whistled past his helmet. His legs moved before his brain engaged, and he leaned partway through the hatch, suddenly face to face with a human female pilot who had an impressive blaster. The shot knocked him backward, but blaster fire wasn't enough to penetrate Katarn armor, and he simply shook himself and raised his Dees again, finding his mind completely blank except for the single purpose of returning fire. Sev fired. There was no such thing as winging someone or shooting them in the leg, whatever the holovids depicted, and he did what he was trained to do. The cockpit was full of smoke, the pilot draped at an awkward angle across the seat. It was only when the smoke began clearing that Sev realized there was a co-pilot, a man, and he was dead too. "Shab," Sev said. "Maybe I could have done that better." Scorch peered into the cockpit. "Let's try that again without the dead bit, shall we?" "I wanted to chat with them," Boss said. He hauled Sev back by his shoulder and wrapped him in the chest plate. "Now how am I going to work out who they are?" "Leave it to me." Fixer pushed past them and scrambled into the cockpit, hauling the bodies out of the way and pushing them out onto the grass with a wet thud. "At least I can interrogate the onboard computer and tell you where they came from." Boss and Scorch contemplated the bodies in the grass, turning them over and rifling through their flight suits. Now that the adrenaline was ebbing, Sev felt a mix of vague dread flood him just as it had when he'd screwed up in training. There was no Sergeant Vao around to give him a good hiding for his incompetence, but it was as bad now as it ever was. Next time he saw Vao, he knew that his old sergeant would see the failure on his face and give him grief for it. There was no good enough. There was only perfect. Sev had no excuse for not being perfect, because he'd been designed from the genome up to be the galaxy's best. Anything he got wrong was down to laziness. There were no excuses. Vao said so. It was like waiting for the blow to hurt. "Well," Fixer said. "Interesting." He jumped out of the Crusher and brandished his datapad. "They passed through Commando, and they transmitted data back. I'll unscramble that later." Scorch sucked his teeth noisily. Topoka's not exactly the crossroads of the Outer Rim. So the Kaminoans had sent someone after them after Kosai, in fact. Nobody popped into Topoka City uninvited or stopped to refuel. You only went there if you had business with the Kaminoans. "Bounty hunters?" Sev asked. Boss examined a handful of chips in flimsy. "We can crack the identity chips later. The important thing is that we know we're not the only ones who've tracked Kosai this far, and the Awa bait will know all about Dasucha by now." Sev was starting to feel anxious. They were definitely going up against the Kaminoans and the Seps now. It was going to be a race. Topoka would send someone else as soon as they knew the Crusher was missing, if they didn't already. "Better get a move on," said Scorch. "No telling who else will have to elbow out of the way." Sev trailed the others back to the TIV, still uneasy and angry with himself for not taking the Crusher's crew alive. "No," he said. "Could be anybody."